The road to Blackthorn Bay twisted like a serpent through the cliffs, its asphalt cracked and crumbling at the edges where the land threatened to drop into the sea. Kate Holloway tightened her grip on the steering wheel, her knuckles pale in the dim light of the setting sun. The rental car's GPS had given up miles ago, leaving her to navigate by memory and instinct. She hadn't told anyone she was coming here, not her editor, not her ex-husband, not even her sister, who would have begged her to reconsider. The town was barely a speck on a map, tucked away along the Oregon coast where the fog rolled in thick and permanent. It was exactly what she needed, somewhere quiet, isolated, and preferably haunted by nothing more than bad weather. But as she drove into the heart of Blackthorn Bay, she felt the weight of something unseen pressing down on her. The town was too quiet. A handful of old brick buildings lined the main road, their windows dark. A gas station with a flickering neon sign stood on the corner, next to a diner with a closed sign hanging lopsided in the window. The only sign of life was a single man sitting on a rusted bench outside a bait shop, staring into the distance, as if watching something that no one else could see. Kate swallowed hard. Small-town charm at its finest. She pulled up to a modest, gray cottage perched on the cliffside. The Holloway Cottage, the listing had called it, as if the house already knew her name. A coincidence, probably. The kind that would make for a great icebreaker if she ever decided to make friends here. She doubted she would. The cottage itself was quaint, with a wraparound porch and a wood-burning stove inside. The air smelled of salt and damp earth. It should have felt cozy, welcoming even, but something about it unsettled her. Maybe it was the way the windows seemed too dark, or how the fog clung to the house like fingers curling around a throat. A movement from the house next door caught her attention. An elderly woman stood at her window, staring at Kate. She didn't wave, didn't smile, just stood there, her face partially obscured by the curtain. Kate offered a small nod, but the woman didn't react. And amp, quote, friendly, and amp, quote, Kate muttered under her breath. She grabbed her bags from the trunk and made her way up the steps. The floorboards creaked beneath her weight, and for a brief moment, she swore she heard a whisper, so soft it could have been the wind. Kate shook it off. She was exhausted. It had been a long drive. She unlocked the door, stepped inside, and felt the temperature drop instantly. The air inside the house was ice cold, unnatural compared to the mild autumn evening outside. The scent of damp wood filled her nostrils, and though the cottage had been cleaned before she arrived, she could detect a faint, underlying smell of something else, something stale. She exhaled and rubbed her arms. And amp, quote, alright ghosts, if you're here, rent's due on the 1st. And amp, quote. The joke made her feel marginally better. Kate spent the next hour unpacking and settling in, forcing herself to ignore the strange heaviness in the air. She made coffee, opened a book, pretended not to notice that the house still felt too cold. By the time the sun had fully set, the fog had crept up from the sea, swallowing the town in its ghostly tendrils. Kate stood at the window, watching it slither through the streets, wrapping around streetlights and houses. It was thicker than any fog she'd ever seen, moving strangely, as if it were alive. Then she heard it, a whisper, faint, barely there. It came from just outside the house. Kate's breath itched. She turned off the lamp, plunging the room into darkness, and listened. The whisper came again, more distinct this time. Not the wind, not her imagination. A voice. No, multiple voices, too quiet to make out the words, but they were there, murmuring, rustling like dry leaves against the window. Kate's fingers tightened around the curtain as she debated whether or not to look outside. Every part of her rational brain screamed, don't do it, but curiosity gnawed at her. Slowly, cautiously, she pulled back the curtain. The fog rushed against the glass, as if something had been standing there, waiting. Kate jerked back, heart pounding. The whispers stopped. The fog didn't move, didn't fade. It just sat there, watching. Kate let the curtain fall shut and forced out a laugh, though it sounded weak even to her own ears. And amp, quote, alright Kate, you're sleep deprived, that's all. You're in a creepy new town. You just need rest. And amp, quote. She climbed into bed that night with the covers pulled tight around her, trying to shake the lingering unease. But long after she closed her eyes, she swore she could still hear it, the whispering. And somewhere in the fog, something whispered back. Kate woke with a start. For a long moment, she lay still, heart hammering, her ears straining for the sound that had pulled her from sleep. The room was dark, save for the dim glow of the street lamp outside, its light barely cutting through the thick fog pressing against her window. Then she heard it again, a whisper, not outside this time, inside. Kate's breath itched. She turned her head slowly, her pulse thudding in her ears. The bedroom was empty. The door was still closed. The whisper had been so close, as if someone had been standing right beside her bed. She sat up and flicked on the lamp. The room bloomed in pale yellow light, chasing away the shadows. Nothing was out of place. Her bags were still at the foot of the bed, her jacket draped over the chair in the corner. Nothing. Kate exhaled sharply, rubbing her face. Jesus, get it together. It was the exhaustion, the long drive, the stress. A hypnagogic hallucination, her rational mind supplied. A trick of the brain when caught between sleep and wakefulness. Still, she left the lamp on for the rest of the night. The next morning, Kate pushed aside her unease and set out to explore Blackthorn Bay in the daylight. The fog had receded, leaving the town bathed in weak autumn sunlight. The sea stretched out beyond the cliffs, dark and restless. Gulls wheeled overhead, their cries sharp against the silence. Kate pulled her coat tighter around herself as she walked down the main street. The town looked almost normal now, if you ignored the boarded-up windows on some of the buildings and the way people avoided eye contact when she passed. She stepped into the Gull's Nest, the town's only bar, hoping for coffee and conversation. The bartender, a tall man in his 40s with graying hair, glanced up as she approached the counter. His name tag read Sam. And amp, quote, "You're the one who moved into the Holloway cottage, and amp, quote," he said, not unkindly. Kate blinked. And amp, quote, "That obvious? And amp, quote, and amp, quote, in a town this small?" "Yeah, and amp, quote." He poured her a cup of coffee without asking if she wanted one. And amp, quote, "People don't come to Blackthorn Bay unless they have a reason." And amp, quote. Kate wrapped her hands around the warm mug. And amp, quote, "I'm a journalist, and amp, quote," she said. And amp, quote, "Freelance. Just needed a quiet place to work." And amp, quote. Sam studied her for a moment, then nodded. And amp, quote, "Well, you got the quiet part right." And amp, quote. Kate hesitated before asking. And amp, quote, "What's with the fog here?" And amp, quote. Sam's expression barely flickered, but Kate caught it. A moment of hesitation, like he was choosing his words carefully. And amp, quote, "Coastal town." And amp, quote, he said. And amp, quote, "We get fog." And amp, quote. And amp, quote, "Not like this." And amp, quote, Kate countered. And amp, quote, "It moves weird." And amp, quote. She stopped herself before mentioning the whispers. She wasn't about to sound like a lunatic on day one. Sam wiped the counter with deliberate slowness. And amp, quote, "Fog's just fog." And amp, quote, he said finally. Kate wasn't buying it. Before she could press further, the bar's front door swung open, letting in a gust of salty air, and a man with a wild look in his eyes. And amp, quote, "Calloway's missing." And amp, quote, the man blurted, his voice sharp with panic. The bar went silent. Sam set down the rag, his jaw tightening. And amp, quote, "When?" And amp, quote. And amp, quote, "Last night." And amp, quote, the man said. And amp, quote, "Went out on his boat, never came back. Coast Guard's looking, but." And amp, quote. His gaze flickered to Kate, like he wasn't sure he should be saying this in front of an outsider. Sam exhaled through his nose. And amp, quote, "They won't find him." And amp, quote. Kate's skin prickled. And amp, quote, "Why not?" And amp, quote. The man ignored her. He just turned and walked out, muttering under his breath. Kate looked back at Sam. And amp, quote, "Okay, seriously, what's going on in this town?" And amp, quote. Sam gave her a long, level look. Then he leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. And amp, quote, "If you're smart." And amp, quote, he said. And amp, quote, "You'll stop asking questions." And amp, quote. A chill ran through Kate, but not from fear, from something else. Excitement. She had come to Blackthorn Bay hoping for a quiet place to write. But now, Now she had a story. That night, Kate sat on her porch, wrapped in a thick blanket, watching the fog roll in. It came slowly at first, creeping up from the cliffs like a living thing. The waves crashed below, sending salty spray into the air. But the mist swallowed it all. Within minutes, the town was hidden behind a veil of shifting gray. Kate shivered. The whispers came soon after, soft, distant, like wind through dry grass. Kate held her breath. This time, she listened. The voices were indistinct, layered, as if dozens of people were whispering at once. She closed her eyes, trying to make out the words. And then, one of the whispers shifted, became something else. Not a whisper, a breath. Right behind her, Kate whirled around, heart in her throat. Nothing, just her empty porch, the fog pressing in, the wind carrying the scent of salt and something rotting. She exhaled shakily, pressing a hand to her chest. Then she saw them, footprints, trailing through the dew on her porch, not hers, and they stopped just behind her chair. Kate bolted inside and locked the door. She didn't sleep that night, because long after she had buried herself beneath the covers, the whispers didn't stop. They only got closer. The fog never truly left. Even in daylight, when the sun managed to pierce through the overcast sky, the mist still lingered, clinging to the streets, curling between buildings like spectral fingers reluctant to let go. Kate tried to shake off the unease that had settled in her bones since the night before. She hadn't told anyone about the footprints. What would she even say? "Hey, Sam, by the way, some invisible thing stood behind me last night and whispered in my ear. Should I be worried?" Yeah, that would go over well. Instead, she distracted herself the best way she knew how, by digging for answers. The Blackthorn Bay Library was barely more than a single room attached to the town hall. Dust motes floated in the stale air, and the bookshelves were filled with titles that looked like they hadn't been checked out since the 70s. The librarian, a woman in her 60s with tight silver curls, gave Kate a wary glance as she entered. "Mrs. Lewis," her name tag read. Kate smiled, trying to seem harmless. And quote, "Hi, I'm new in town." And quote, Mrs. Lewis didn't return the smile. And quote, "I know." And quote, "Okay then." Kate leaned against the counter. And quote, "I was wondering if you have any old newspapers, archives? Anything about strange occurrences in Blackthorn Bay?" And quote, the librarian's expression barely shifted, but Kate saw the tension creep into her shoulders. And quote, "What kind of occurrences?" And quote, Kate hesitated. If she mentioned the fog, she had a feeling the woman would shut her down. And quote, "Disappearances, mostly." And quote, Mrs. Lewis stared at her for a long moment. Then, with a sigh, she gestured toward a set of filing cabinets in the corner. And quote, "Records go back about 100 years. If you're looking for missing persons, start with the Calloway family." And quote, Kate's pulse quickened. Calloway, the man who disappeared last night. She muttered a thanks and hurried over to the cabinets, fingers itching for answers. Kate scanned the brittle newspaper clippings, her stomach knotting tighter with each one. 1932, Daniel Calloway, fisherman, lost at sea, body never found. 1957, Margaret Calloway, age 9, wandered into the fog, never seen again. 1984, Thomas Calloway, reported missing after a fishing trip, boat recovered, no sign of him. 1999, Jonah Calloway, last seen walking home one evening, family claims. And quote, "The fog took him." And quote, "Now, 2023, Benjamin Calloway, vanished just last night." Kate's fingers trembled over the last article. This wasn't just bad luck. This was a pattern, a generational curse, a legacy of disappearances, all linked to the fog. Kate swallowed hard. She suddenly felt watched. The hair on the back of her neck rose, and the library felt too quiet, too still. She turned, half expecting to see someone standing behind her, but there was no one, only the large window overlooking the street, and the fog, pushing against the glass. Kate arrived just in time to see the Coast Guard packing up. No urgency, no hope, just grim faces and silent acceptance. The crowd of onlookers was small, and none of them seemed surprised. Kate spotted Sam near the bait shop and made a beeline for him. And quote, "They're giving up?" And quote, she demanded. Sam exhaled through his nose. And quote, "They never started." And quote, and quote, Jesus, Sam, a man is missing, and amp, quote. Sam met her gaze, his expression unreadable, and amp, quote. Calloway's go missing, and amp, quote. He said simply, and amp, quote. Always have, and amp, quote. Kate felt her frustration boil over, and amp, quote. That's not an answer, that's just accepting it like it's normal, like it's, and amp, quote. She gestured toward the waves, toward the fog still curling around the pier, and amp, quote. Inevitable, and amp, quote. Sam didn't flinch, and amp, quote. Maybe it is, and amp, quote. Kate opened her mouth to argue, but a voice cut through the air, sharp and frantic, and amp, quote. I saw him, and amp, quote. The crowd parted as an old fisherman staggered forward. His wild eyes darted between faces, desperate for someone to believe him, and amp, quote. Ben! I saw Ben last night. He was out on the water, and the fog just swallowed him, and amp, quote. Murmurs rippled through the onlookers. Someone muttered, and amp, quote. Not again, and amp, quote. Kate stepped forward, and amp, quote. What do you mean it swallowed him, and amp, quote. The old man turned to her, and amp, quote. 1 second, he was there. Next second, gone. No splash, no struggle, just gone. Like something pulled him under, and amp, quote. Kate's stomach twisted. She glanced at Sam, expecting to see skepticism on his face. Instead, he just looked tired, like he'd heard this before, like he already knew it was true. That night, the fog came earlier than usual. Kate sat in her cottage, staring out the window, waiting. The whispers came like clockwork, soft at first, then layered, urgent. But this time, she did something different. This time, she whispered back, and amp, quote. Who are you? And amp, quote. For a moment, the fog seemed to still. The air tightened. Then, faint and distant, she heard it. A voice. Not layered, not indistinct, clear. A single word. A name. And amp, quote. Ben. And amp, quote. Kate's blood ran cold. The whisper came again, closer. And amp, quote. Help me. And amp, quote. Kate's breath hitched. She pressed her hand against the glass. The fog swirled on the other side, and for a fleeting second, she saw something move in the mist. A shape, a figure, standing just beyond the window. And amp, quote. Ben, and amp, quote. She whispered. The figure stepped forward, and suddenly Kate saw him, Benjamin Calloway. His face pale, eyes hollow, mouth parted as if struggling to speak. His skin was damp, his clothes tattered. He lifted a trembling hand, pressing it against the other side of the glass. And then, the fog took him. He was gone. Kate gasped, stumbling back from the window. The whispering exploded, voices overlapping, growing frantic. Something pounded against the walls of the cottage. The windows shuddered in their frames. Kate clamped her hands over her ears, heart slamming against her ribs. And amp, quote. Stop. Just stop. And amp, quote. And then, silence. The house settled. The whispers vanished. Kate stood in the center of the room, shaking, staring at the empty window. Ben Calloway was still out there, trapped in the fog, and Kate Holloway was going to find out why. Kate didn't sleep. Not after what she'd seen. Not after Ben Calloway had appeared in the fog, his pale face pressed against the glass, only to be ripped away before her eyes. She spent the night replaying it over and over, her pulse hammering in her throat. It hadn't been a hallucination. It hadn't been a trick of the light. It was real. And if Ben Calloway was still out there, if he was trapped, then she needed to understand what the hell was happening in Blackthorn Bay. By morning, the fog had retreated back to the sea, but the air still felt wrong, heavy, watched. Kate threw on yesterday's jeans, grabbed her notebook, and went looking for answers. She started at the Gull's Nest. Sam was behind the bar, cleaning glasses that didn't need cleaning. He didn't look up as she approached. And amp, quote. I saw him. And amp, quote. Kate said, cutting straight to the point. Sam exhaled through his nose. And amp, quote. No, you didn't. And amp, quote. And amp, quote. Yes, I did. And amp, quote. She shot back. And amp, quote. Ben Calloway. He was outside my window last night. He spoke to me. He asked for help. And amp, amp, quote. Sam set the glass down carefully, and amp, quote. You're sure about that? And amp, quote. Kate leaned in, and amp, quote. What is this town hiding? And amp, quote. Sam's expression darkened, and amp, quote. Go home, Kate, and amp, quote. And amp, quote. No, and amp, quote. She slammed her hand against the counter, and amp, quote. I don't scare easy, Sam. People in this town keep disappearing, and no one seems to care. You all just accept it, like it's normal. But it's not, and I want to know why. And amp, quote. A long silence stretched between them. Finally, Sam sighed and rubbed the back of his neck. And amp, quote. There's a reason people don't talk about the fog. And amp, quote. He muttered. And amp, quote. Then maybe it's time they start. And amp, quote. Sam looked at her for a long moment, then shook his head. And amp, quote. If you really want answers, check under your floorboards. And amp, quote. Kate blinked. And amp, quote. What? And amp, quote. But Sam just turned away and went back to wiping down the bar. Conversation over. Kate was halfway back to her cottage when the realization hit her. The floorboards. She remembered stepping on one in the bedroom that had felt a little loose. Heart pounding, she ran the rest of the way home. Back inside, she tore up the floor. It didn't take long. One of the boards near the bed lifted easily, as if someone had pried it open before. Beneath it, buried in the dust and darkness, was something old, a leather-bound journal. Kate's breath itched as she pulled it out, her fingers trembling slightly. The edges were brittle, the pages yellowed with age. The cover was embossed with a name, barely legible through time and dust. Eleanor Vale. Kate swallowed hard. She knew that name. She'd seen it in the library yesterday. Eleanor Vale had lived in Blackthorn Bay a century ago. She had written about the fog, about voices whispering to her in the night. She had vanished in 1897. Her fingers trembled as she flipped to the first page. The ink had faded, but the words were still there, still sharp with desperation. September 12th, 1897. The whispers return tonight. They come with the fog. I hear them calling my name. Kate swallowed. The next entry was worse. September 15th, 1897. I saw them today. Shapes in the mist. Watching. Waiting. They want me to listen. Kate's stomach twisted as she flipped ahead. The entries grew more frantic. The handwriting shakier. September 22nd, 1897. I was wrong. The fog is not haunted. It is not natural. It is alive. And it is hungry. Kate's breath came faster now. She forced herself to turn the pages, dread curling in her gut. Then she reached the final entry. It was scrawled hastily, the words smudged and desperate. September 25th, 1897. I heard my own voice in the fog tonight. If you hear your own voice, run. Kate slammed the book shut, her pulse pounding. The air in the cottage felt thicker suddenly, suffocating. She backed away from the journal, from the open floorboards. She needed out, she needed air. She bolted for the door and threw it open, and froze, because the fog had already returned, thick, unnatural, waiting, and from deep within it, Kate heard a whisper, a voice she knew too well, her own. And amp, quote. Kate, come outside. And amp, quote. Kate stood frozen in the doorway, her breath catching in her throat. The fog was thicker than before, a dense, writhing wall of gray, shifting unnaturally against the windless night, and from deep within it she had heard herself. And amp, quote. Kate, come outside. And amp, quote. The voice had been hers, but wrong, stretched, twisted, like something trying too hard to sound human. Her fingers clenched around the doorframe. And amp, quote. Don't move. And amp, quote. Her mind screamed it at her, but her body betrayed her, leaning forward, almost drawn toward the voice. The fog pulled at her, not physically but mentally, a silent pressure, urging her to step outside. Her vision blurred at the edges. The cold crept into her bones. Then, just as her foot inched over the threshold, something grabbed her wrist. Kate gasped, spinning around. Mrs. Thorne, her landlady, stood behind her, gripping Kate's wrist with surprising strength for someone in her 70s. Her nails dug into Kate's skin. And amp, quote. You never answer when it calls. And amp, quote. Mrs. Thorne hissed. Her eyes were wide, frantic. And amp, quote. Close the door, now. And amp, quote. Kate hesitated. And amp, quote, but, and amp, quote, and amp, quote, now, and amp, quote. Something in her voice shattered Kate's paralysis. She stumbled back, slamming the door shut, locking it, bolting it, anything to keep whatever was out there from coming in. The moment the door clicked, the whispers stopped. The fog outside went silent. Kate and Mrs. Thorne stood there for a long moment, both breathing hard. Then Mrs. Thorne turned to her, eyes dark with warning. And amp, quote, you're in deep now, girl. And amp, quote, Kate swallowed. And amp, quote, what the hell is happening in this town? And amp, quote, Mrs. Thorne exhaled sharply, letting go of Kate's wrist. And amp, quote, I was hoping you wouldn't have to know. And amp, quote, Kate crossed her arms. And amp, quote, too late. And amp, quote, a silence stretched between them. Then Mrs. Thorne sighed. And amp, quote, get your coat. And amp, quote, she muttered. And amp, quote, you need to see something. And amp, quote, they walked through town in silence, the fog keeping its distance, as if waiting. Mrs. Thorne led her up a narrow, overgrown path behind the old church. The graveyard loomed ahead, weathered tombstones jutting from the earth like crooked teeth. Kate shivered. And amp, quote, how long has this been happening? And amp, quote, she asked. Mrs. Thorne didn't look at her. And amp, quote, as long as Blackthorn Bay has existed. And amp, quote, Kate's stomach tightened. And amp, quote, the fog? And amp, quote, Mrs. Thorne nodded. And amp, quote, and the things inside it. And amp, quote, they reached a mausoleum at the far end of the graveyard. Its stone door cracked open. Mrs. Thorne stepped inside without hesitation. Kate hesitated. Something felt wrong here. The air tasted stale, thick with something that wasn't quite dust. But she followed. Inside, Mrs. Thorne knelt beside a stone sarcophagus and ran her fingers along the lid. Dust fell away, revealing a name carved into the stone. Eleanor Vale. Kate's breath caught. And amp, quote, the woman who wrote the journal. And amp, quote, she whispered. Mrs. Thorne nodded. And amp, quote, the first to warn us. And amp, quote, Kate ran a shaking hand over the cold stone. And amp, quote, what happened to her? And amp, quote, Mrs. Thorne's voice was grim. And amp, quote, she disappeared, just like the others. And amp, quote, Kate swallowed hard. And amp, quote, what are they? The things in the fog? And amp, quote, Mrs. Thorne hesitated before answering. And amp, quote, we call them the Hollow Ones. And amp, quote, a chill ran down Kate's spine. Mrs. Thorne continued, her voice low and tight. And amp, quote, they were human once, a long time ago, but they changed. And amp, quote, Kate frowned. And amp, quote, changed how? And amp, quote, Mrs. Thorne's eyes met hers. And amp, quote, the fog took them. It doesn't just kill, it consumes. And amp, quote, Kate's mind reeled. And amp, quote, consumes what? And amp, quote, Mrs. Thorne's lips pressed into a thin line. And amp, quote, them, their faces, their voices, their memories. It hollows them out, leaves them as echoes. And amp, quote, Kate's stomach twisted. And amp, quote, and the ones who disappear? And amp, quote, she whispered. And amp, quote, are they dead? And amp, quote, Mrs. Thorne shook her head. And amp, quote, no, that's the worst part. They're still here, trapped in the mist, calling out, looking for a way back. And amp, quote, Kate's breath hitched. She thought of Ben Calloway's face, pale and desperate in the fog. The whisper of her own voice calling to her from the mist. She had nearly stepped out there, nearly become one of them. Her fingers curled into fists. And amp, quote, how do we stop it? And amp, quote, she asked. Mrs. Thorne looked at her, and for the first time that night, fear crept into her eyes. And amp, quote, we don't. And amp, quote, Kate's stomach dropped. And amp, quote, what do you mean? And amp, quote, Mrs. Thorne exhaled. And amp, quote, the hollow ones need someone to take their place. That's how it works. They can't come back unless someone else goes in. And amp, quote, Kate's blood ran cold. And amp, quote, you mean, and amp, quote, she swallowed. And amp, quote, a trade. And amp, quote, Mrs. Thorne nodded, her face lined with something like guilt. Kate's mind spun. If that was true, then someone in town had to be making the trades. Someone was choosing who disappeared. Her pulse pounded in her ears. And amp, quote, who's doing it? And amp, quote, Mrs. Thorne didn't answer. She just turned and walked away, her silhouette fading into the night. Kate stood there, heart racing, surrounded by graves. Somewhere in the distance, the fog stirred, and this time, the whisper didn't call her name, it laughed. Kate barely remembered walking home. Her mind spun with Mrs. Thorne's words, with the journal's warnings, with the truth that was finally beginning to take shape. The fog didn't just kill people, it hollowed them out, took their faces, their voices, their memories, and someone in Blackthorn Bay was feeding it. The idea made her stomach churn. She had spent the last few days thinking the town was simply indifferent to the disappearances, too used to loss to react. But what if they weren't indifferent? What if they were complicit? She locked the door behind her and leaned against it, trying to steady her breathing. The cottage was dark, save for the dim glow of the street lamp outside. The silence was thick, pressing in around her. She needed sleep. She needed a plan. But as she crossed the room, something felt off. The air was colder than before, and then she noticed it, her reflection. In the mirror above the fireplace, her reflection stood a half-second too slow. Kate froze, breath caught in her throat. She lifted a hand. Her reflection copied the movement, but with the slightest delay. Her stomach twisted into a knot. Slowly, carefully, she stepped closer. The woman in the mirror was her, but wrong. The face was the same, the clothes were the same, but the eyes were empty. Kate's breath came faster now. Her mirror self tilted her head just slightly, watching her. Then, it smiled. Kate jerked back, slamming into the wall. The reflection did not. It just stood there, smiling, waiting. Kate's shaking hand reached for the lamp. The moment light filled the room, the mirror snapped back to normal. Her real reflection staring back, wide-eyed and terrified. Her stomach lurched. It had been real. They see her now. Kate didn't sleep. She spent the rest of the night sitting in the corner of the room, watching the mirror, waiting for it to move again. It never did, but the feeling never left. She was being watched by something that was learning her. By morning, she had made up her mind. She needed to find the last person in town who might tell her the truth. She needed to find Margaret Bell. Margaret Bell's house was on the edge of town, hidden behind a rusted iron gate and half-dead ivy. The locals never talked about her. Some claimed she was senile. Others just said she was better left alone. Kate wasn't interested in leaving anyone alone. She knocked 3 times. Silence. She knocked again. And quote, Mrs. Bell? I just have a few questions. And quote. The door unlocked. Not opened, just unlocked. Kate hesitated, then pushed it open. The inside of the house was dark, stale. The air was thick with dust, and the curtains had been drawn so tightly that barely a sliver of daylight crept in. And quote, Mrs. Bell? And quote. A voice rasped from the back of the house. And quote. You shouldn't be here. And quote. Kate followed the voice to the living room, where an elderly woman sat in a high-backed chair, staring into the fireplace. She was thin, almost fragile, her silver hair pulled back in a loose bun, but her eyes were sharp. And quote, You're the journalist. And quote, Margaret said, voice hoarse. And quote, The one digging where she shouldn't. And quote, Kate swallowed hard. And quote, I saw Ben Calloway. And quote, Margaret's gaze didn't waver. And quote, No, you didn't. And quote. And quote, Yes, I did. He was in the fog. He spoke to me. And quote. Kate hesitated, then added, and quote, and last night, I think it tried to become me. And quote. For the first time, something like fear flickered across Margaret's face. And quote. Then it's already too late for you. And quote, she whispered. Kate's chest tightened. And quote, What are they? And amp, quote. Margaret exhaled shakily, and amp, quote. The hollow ones were people once. The fog took them, erased them, but they don't disappear completely. They linger, in the mist, in the mirrors, in the whispers, trying to get back. And amp, quote. Kate's fingers curled into fists. And amp, quote. And someone in this town is feeding it. And amp, quote. Margaret's face darkened. And amp, quote. Not just someone. And amp, quote. Kate's stomach twisted. And amp, quote. Who? And amp, quote. Margaret leaned forward, her voice barely more than a breath. And amp, quote. The founding families. And amp, quote. She whispered. And amp, quote. The ones who built Blackthorn Bay. They made a pact long ago, a trade. And amp, quote. Kate's blood went cold. And amp, quote. What kind of trade? And amp, quote. Margaret's eyes locked onto hers. And amp, quote. One life, every generation, to keep the rest of us safe. And amp, quote. Kate felt sick. And amp, quote. And you. And amp, quote. She swallowed. And amp, quote. You survived. And amp, quote. Margaret's lips trembled. And amp, quote. I was supposed to be taken. And amp, quote. She murmured. And amp, quote. But my sister, she stepped into the fog instead. She offered herself in my place. And amp, quote. Her voice broke. And amp, quote. I can still hear her. And amp, quote. Kate's heart ached, but her mind was already racing. The founding families. The town wasn't afraid of the fog. They were using it, choosing who disappeared. Kate forced herself to ask. And amp, quote. Who makes the decision? And amp, quote. Margaret's face fell. Then, so quietly Kate almost didn't hear it. And amp, quote. The mayor. And amp, quote. Kate sucked in a breath. And amp, quote. Mayor Leland Wright? And amp, quote. Margaret nodded. And amp, quote. He's the last of them, the last guardian of the pact. And amp, quote. She swallowed. And amp, quote. And he knows you're asking questions. And amp, quote. Kate felt an icy weight settle in her stomach. Something in Margaret's expression shifted. Her face suddenly tighter, paler, her breath turned shallow. Kate stepped forward. And amp, quote. Mrs. Bell? And amp, quote. Margaret gasped. Her eyes widened, terrified. Kate spun just as the room dimmed. Not from nightfall, from the fog. It seeped under the door, through the cracks in the walls. Kate reached for Margaret's arm. And amp, quote. We have to go. And amp, quote. But Margaret's body jerked. Her mouth opened too wide, and from deep inside her throat, she whispered. But it wasn't Margaret's voice anymore. It was Kate's. And amp, quote. Kate, it's time. And amp, quote. Kate screamed. The fog rushed forward, and then darkness. Kate woke up choking on fog. Cold, damp air pressed against her skin, thick as oil, crawling down her throat as she gasped for breath. She tried to move, but her limbs were heavy, sluggish, like she was trapped in some half-conscious state between waking and dreaming. No, not dreaming. The fog was inside Margaret Bell's house, filling the air like living smoke, wrapping around her wrists, her ankles slithering toward her mouth. A voice, her own voice, whispered from somewhere in the darkness. And amp, quote. Kate, don't fight it. And amp, quote. Panic shot through her. She kicked, clawed at the air, forcing herself upright. Her head spun. The world around her was wrong, distorted, shifting, as if reality itself was being peeled apart at the edges. And then, she saw Margaret. The old woman sat motionless in her chair. Her mouth was still open, but her eyes were gone. Not gouged out, not bloody, just gone, like something had emptied her. Kate staggered back, bile rising in her throat. And amp, quote. Margaret? And amp, quote. No answer. The fog whispered around her, curling at the edges of her vision. Something moved within it, not a person, a shape, twisting, unfinished, like a half-formed memory trying to make itself real. Kate's body screamed at her to run, but before she could, the whispering surged forward, rushing inside her head, filling every inch of her skull with a single word. And amp, quote. Stay. And amp, quote. Kate slammed her hands over her ears, and amp, quote, no, and amp, quote. The fog shuddered, and then, it pulled back, retreating. Kate gasped, sucking in air as the suffocating weight lifted. The fog didn't disappear, but it released her. For now, she turned and ran, out of the house, into the street, straight toward the only person left who might have answers, Mayor Leland Wright. Kate's boots pounded against the pavement as she sprinted through the deserted town. No one was outside. Doors were locked, curtains drawn, as if the town had already decided she was gone. She reached City Hall, an old colonial-style building looming over the empty square. The front door was unlocked. Of course it was. He was waiting for her. Kate stormed inside, ignoring the sting in her lungs. The way her body felt wrong, like the fog had brushed against something deep inside her and left fingerprints behind. Leland Wright's office was at the end of the hall. She threw the door open. The mayor sat at his desk, perfectly calm. A man in his 60s, sharp-dressed, well-kept. But his eyes were hollow, not physically, just empty, like a man who had spent too many years staring into the abyss. He barely blinked as Kate stumbled in, breathless, shaking. And amp, quote, you saw them, and amp, quote, he said, not a question, a statement. Kate slammed her hands on the desk. And amp, quote, you knew, and amp, quote. The mayor exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples. And amp, quote, sit down, Miss Holloway. And amp, quote, and amp, quote, go to hell. And amp, quote, Kate spat. And amp, quote, you've been feeding it, haven't you? The fog, the hollow ones. You pick someone, one person every generation, to disappear, to keep the rest of you safe. And amp, quote, Leland sighed. And amp, quote, it's not that simple. And amp, quote, and amp, quote, then make it simple. And amp, quote, Kate snapped. And amp, quote, tell me what the hell is going on in this town. Why are people vanishing? And amp, quote. The mayor leaned back in his chair, folding his hands. For a moment, he was silent. Then, finally, and amp, quote, it started in 1823, and amp, quote, he said. And amp, quote, with the founding of Blackthorn Bay. And amp, quote, Kate didn't move, didn't breathe. And amp, quote, we built this town on a promise. And amp, quote, the mayor continued. And amp, quote, a bargain made long before my time. Our ancestors, your ancestors too, Miss Holloway, settled here on the cliffs, but the land wasn't empty. And amp, quote, his gaze darkened. And amp, quote, they found something in the mist. And amp, quote, Kate's fingers curled into fists. And amp, quote, the hollow ones. And amp, quote, Leland nodded. And amp, quote, they weren't called that back then. They were just figures, voices. People thought they were ghosts, restless souls. And amp, quote, his expression turned grim. And amp, quote, but they weren't. And amp, quote, Kate swallowed. And amp, quote, then what are they? And amp, quote, Leland's voice dropped to a whisper. And amp, quote, echoes. And amp, quote, Kate's stomach turned. And amp, quote, echoes of what? And amp, quote, and amp, quote, of us. And amp, quote, Leland steepled his fingers, his face lined with something almost like guilt. And amp, quote, the fog isn't haunted. And amp, quote, he said. And amp, quote, it isn't cursed. It's alive. And it doesn't just kill. It copies. It steals voices, faces, memories. And when it takes someone completely, it turns them into one of its own. And amp, quote, Kate felt her throat tighten. And amp, quote, so the disappearances. And amp, quote, and amp, quote, are preventative. And amp, quote, Leland said. And amp, quote, we sacrifice one, or the fog takes many. And amp, quote, Kate's blood ran cold. And amp, quote, you're saying if you don't choose someone, it just starts taking people at random? And amp, quote, Leland nodded. And amp, quote, and you've seen what happens when it lingers too long. And amp, amp, quote. Kate thought of Margaret Bell, her missing eyes, her voice, replaced with Kate's own, her stomach twisted, and amp, quote. So who decides? Who picks the one who has to die? And amp, quote. Leland didn't blink, and amp, quote. I do, and amp, quote. Kate felt her knees go weak, and amp, quote. You kill them? And amp, quote. She whispered. The mayor shook his head, and amp, quote. I don't have to, I just name them, the fog does the rest, and amp, quote. Kate staggered back, her mind screamed, Ben Calloway, Jonah Calloway, Eleanor Vale, how many more? How many names had he spoken into the mist? She barely registered her own voice when she asked, and amp, quote. And what happens when someone like me starts asking too many questions? And amp, quote. Leland's eyes flickered, a long, heavy silence. Then, finally, and amp, quote. You tell me, Kate, and amp, quote. Her breath hitched. No. She turned, bolted for the door. But the fog was already there, sliding through the cracks, pouring in from the windows, surrounding her, and from the thick, swirling mist, a voice whispered her name, and amp, quote. Kate, it's time, and amp, quote. She barely had time to scream before the darkness took her. Kate woke up somewhere else. The air was damp, heavy. The fog clung to her skin like cold hands, pressing against her lips, her ears, her eyes. The scent of salt and decay filled her nose. And then she realized she wasn't breathing. Panic flared in her chest. She gasped, choking, her lungs empty, her body refusing to pull in air, because there was no air here, just the fog, thick, endless, alive. She scrambled to her feet, her hands swiping through the mist. The ground beneath her was soft, wet sand. Stone? She couldn't tell. The world around her had no shape, no sky, no horizon, just a swirling gray nothingness stretching in all directions. Then a sound, faint, distant, whispers, not from the fog this time, from people. Kate turned toward the voices. Shapes moved through the mist, shifting, some crawling, some standing, some were incomplete. Half-formed figures, missing eyes, missing mouths, missing entire pieces of themselves. They weren't alive, but they weren't dead either. She felt it now, the truth sinking into her bones. This was where the fog took you, not into the afterlife, not into oblivion, into something worse, a place between. And amp, quote. Kate, and amp, quote. Her head snapped up, a figure stepped forward, one she recognized, and amp, quote. Ben, and amp, quote. He was pale, his skin almost translucent, his eyes hollowed out pits of darkness. His mouth moved, but it took a moment for sound to come out, like the fog had to remember how to let him speak. And amp, quote. You have to leave, and amp, quote. Kate's throat tightened, and amp, quote. And amp, quote. She swallowed hard, and amp, quote. I don't think I can, and amp, quote. Ben shook his head, his movements wrong, like a puppet whose strings had been tangled. And amp, quote. You're not dead yet, but you will be soon. And amp, quote. Kate clenched her fists. And amp, quote. How do I stop it? And amp, quote. Ben's jaw tensed. More figures shifted behind him. Dozens, maybe hundreds. Some were watching her, others just staring into nothing. Not everyone trapped here had held on to themselves. And amp, quote. Listen, and amp, quote. Ben whispered. And amp, quote. There's a way out, a way to break the cycle. And amp, quote. Kate's pulse pounded. And amp, quote. Tell me. And amp, quote. Ben hesitated. Then, and amp, quote. You have to speak a name into the fog. And amp, quote. Kate's stomach dropped. And amp, quote. No. And amp, quote. She whispered. And amp, quote. I won't do that. And amp, quote. And amp, quote. If you don't, it will keep you. And amp, quote. Ben said. And amp, quote. Like it kept us. And amp, quote. A shadow passed through the fog behind him. Someone, or something, moved closer. Ben's expression shifted. Fear. And amp, quote. It knows I'm telling you this. And amp, quote. Kate's breath came faster. And amp, quote, listen to me, and amp, quote, Ben urged, and amp, quote, you only have minutes before it takes you completely. Find a name, speak it, or you'll never leave, and amp, quote. The fog around them shuddered. Kate felt the weight of it pressing into her chest, and then, a second voice whispered behind her, and amp, quote, she's mine now, and amp, quote. Kate spun, and saw it, a hollow one, standing inches away. Its face, her own face, but twisted, warped, its mouth stretched into an unnatural grin. Its skin rippled like a reflection in disturbed water. Kate staggered back. The hollow one lunged, and the fog swallowed her whole. Kate hit the ground hard. A shock of cold slammed through her as she landed on what felt like solid earth, though it shifted beneath her hands like damp sand. The fog churned wildly, twisting around her in thick, suffocating coils. The hollow one was close. She couldn't see it, but she could feel it, a presence pressing against her skin, against her mind. Its whisper curled through the air, wrong and warped, a mockery of her own voice. And amp, quote, you don't belong here, but you will soon, and amp, quote. Kate scrambled backward, breath ragged. Think, Kate, think. The fog was alive. It didn't just take people, it consumed them, absorbed them into something between life and death. Ben had told her how to escape, and amp, quote, speak a name into the fog, and amp, quote. Her stomach twisted. Could she do it? Could she really condemn someone else to this fate? She forced herself upright, legs shaking. Around her, the fog shifted, revealing glimpses of the others. Hollowed-out figures, faces half-formed, some with no features at all. They were watching her. Some moved forward, arms twitching, mouths gaping in soundless whispers. Kate backed away, and then, it stepped out of the fog. Her copy, her hollow one, the thing wearing her face smiled. But it wasn't just a copy, it was becoming her. She saw it now, the subtle shifts in its body, the way it mimicked her movements a split second too late, the way its edges rippled, flickering between shapes. It was learning her. It wanted to replace her. Kate ran. Her feet pounded against the shifting ground as she bolted forward, her lungs burning with each frantic breath. The fog moved with her, twisting, pulling, trying to drag her back into itself. No landmarks, no direction. The landscape was nothing but an endless, shifting void, a space between worlds, filled with echoes of people who had already been erased. She wasn't just lost. She was nowhere, but she wasn't alone. Figures loomed in the mist, some recognizable, others barely human. She caught glimpses of Ben, of Margaret, of strangers whose faces were only half-remembered shadows. They didn't speak, they just watched. And amp, quote, Kate, come back, and amp, quote. She whirled. Her copy was still there, moving toward her, step for step, its grin stretching too wide. And amp, quote, I can take your place. And amp, quote. Kate's blood ran cold. It was offering her a way out. It was telling her, if she let it become her, she could be free. Her stomach twisted. And amp, quote, no. And amp, quote, she whispered. The hollow one's head tilted, and for the first time, she saw it, a flicker of anger. It lunged. Kate dodged at the last second, but the fog moved with it, wrapping around her like ropes. She fought, twisting, kicking, gasping as the mist pushed into her mouth, into her nose, filling her lungs with something too heavy, too wrong. And amp, quote, it's over, Kate. And amp, quote, her own voice. The hollow one was inside her head now. She was losing. And amp, quote, speak a name into the fog. And amp, quote. Ben's words cut through the suffocating panic. Kate clenched her teeth, fighting against the weight of the mist pressing into her body. She didn't want to do this, didn't want to choose, but she could feel herself slipping away. Her thoughts fractured, memories unraveling. Her mother's face, the smell of coffee, the sound of rain on the window, all fading. The fog was taking her. Her hollow one was almost complete. And amp, quote, Kate, just let go. And amp, quote, no, she wouldn't be erased. She forced the words out. And amp, quote, Leland Wright. And amp, quote. The fog shuddered. Everything stopped. Kate gasped as the weight on her chest lifted, the crushing pressure vanishing in an instant. The hollow one jerked, its form rippling, its face distorting into something unrecognizable. And then, the fog turned on itself. It rushed past Kate, swirling like a hurricane, dragging something unseen into its depths. A scream, not hers, ripped through the void, and suddenly, she was falling. Kate's body hit the floor of her cottage with a sickening thud. She gasped, this time, for real air. The weight was gone, the fog gone. She was back. Her limbs shook violently, every inch of her body numb with cold. She could still feel it, the aftertaste of the mist in her lungs, the whispers still curling at the edges of her mind. She pushed herself upright, breathing hard, scanning the room. Nothing had changed, but she had. Her gaze flicked to the mirror. For a single, terrifying moment, she expected to see someone else's face staring back. But it was just her hands clenched into fists. She was alive, and Mayor Leland Wright was not. The town found his body the next morning, or rather, what was left of it. Kate stood on the edge of the square, watching as the sheriff's men pulled his hollowed-out corpse from his office. His eyes were gone. His face was barely a face at all, like something had tried to remember him but failed. The people of Blackthorn Bay didn't ask questions. They just watched, silent, unsurprised, and unafraid, because they knew the deal had been paid, and for now, the fog was satisfied. She could have left. She should have left. But something inside her wouldn't let her, because the town was still hiding things, because the hollow ones weren't done, because someone had to remember. Kate pulled Eleanor Vale's journal from her bag, running her fingers over the worn leather. The first entry had been a warning. The last entry had been a plea. And amp, quote, if you hear your own voice in the fog, run. And amp, quote. Kate hadn't run, and now she understood. The hollow ones never stopped watching, and one day, they will whisper again. She closed the journal, exhaled slowly, and turned away from the crowd. The fog had retreated for now, but it would come back, and next time, she would be ready. Kate Holloway should have left Blackthorn Bay. She should have packed her bags, climbed into her car, and driven until the town was nothing but a half-forgotten nightmare in her rearview mirror. But she didn't. Instead, she stayed, because the fog wasn't gone. Not really. And something deep inside her whispered that it never would be. The town barely spoke of Leland Wright's death. No funeral, no mourning, just a quiet acceptance, the same way they had accepted every other disappearance, every other offering to the mist. Blackthorn Bay continued as it always had, a town of silence and secrets, its people moving through their routines as if nothing had changed. Kate watched them all, and she knew the cycle would start again, because someone in this town would take Leland's place, and the fog would whisper again. It always did. Kate sat at her desk, flipping through Eleanor Vale's journal for the 100th time, the worn leather soft beneath her fingertips. Each page was a warning, written in shaky, desperate script. They come with the fog. They are watching, always watching. Do not listen, do not answer. Kate exhaled through her nose, rubbing her temple. She had ignored that advice, and somehow, she had survived. A knock at the door made her freeze. She glanced at the clock. 11:43 p.m. No one in Blackthorn Bay knocked on doors this late. Slowly, Kate stood, her pulse quickening. The fog had been thick that night, too thick, and her gut told her she wasn't going to like what was waiting for her outside. Still, she had to see. She opened the door, and Sam stood there. The bartender's face was grim, his normally steady hands shaking slightly as he ran them through his hair. His eyes darted over her shoulder, as if expecting something else to be behind her. Kate frowned. And amp, quote, Sam, and amp, quote, and amp, quote, you need to come with me, and amp, quote, he said. Kate's stomach dropped. And amp, quote, why, and amp, quote. Sam hesitated. Then, and amp, quote, they found another body. And amp, quote, Kate's breath hitched. And amp, quote, who? And amp, quote, Sam swallowed. And amp, quote, Mrs. Thorne. And amp, quote, the old woman's body was found near the cliffs, or rather, what was left of it. Kate stood beside Sam and Sheriff Bill Hayes, staring at the thing that had once been her landlady. Her face was gone, not mutilated, not eaten away, just missing, like something had tried to erase her from existence. Kate clenched her fists. She knew what had happened. She had spoken Leland Wright's name into the fog. She had broken the cycle, and the town had made a new one. Sam's voice was hoarse. And amp, quote, she was the next one, wasn't she? And amp, quote. Kate nodded slowly. And amp, quote, looks like it. And amp, quote. The sheriff stiffened, but didn't argue, because deep down, He knew it too. The Hollow Ones needed someone, and the town had chosen. That night, Kate stood on her porch, staring into the mist as it rolled in thicker than ever. It moved differently now, less like a force of nature, more like a presence, a living, breathing thing. Kate inhaled sharply, and amp, quote, I know you can hear me, and amp, quote, she murmured. The fog shuddered. A whisper curled through the air, not words, just a sound, a breath, a promise. Kate took a step forward, her fingers tightening around the railing. And amp, quote, I know what you are now, and amp, quote, she said. And amp, quote, I know what you do, and amp, quote. The whispering grew louder. Kate's heart slammed against her ribs, but she didn't look away. And amp, quote, are you going to take me too? And amp, quote, she asked. Silence, and then the whisper shifted. It wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was a voice, soft, faint, her own. And amp, quote, Kate, it's time. And amp, quote. Kate didn't move, didn't blink. She had heard this before. A month ago, she had almost answered, almost stepped into the mist. But not tonight, not anymore. Instead, she whispered back. And amp, quote, not yet. And amp, quote. The fog hesitated. For the first time, it withdrew. And then, it was gone. The air was still. The night was silent. And Kate Holloway knew this wasn't over. It never would be, because the fog would always come back. It would always whisper. It would always be hungry. And when it did, Kate would be waiting.